Is honesty necessary for social harmony? What is the relationship between truth and justice? Is lying ever warranted? And if not, what are the ethical principles that forbid it? All of this and more in today's video. Is honesty morally necessary? If asked this question spontaneously, without being given much time to think about it, most people, regardless of their philosophical or cultural background, would probably tell you that honesty is an important part of good moral character and a key sign of trustworthiness. Practical wisdom would seem to validate this position, as people intuitively know the importance of honesty in maintaining stable, healthy relationships with others. And honesty is the best policy has long been a common proverb. But despite this apparent consensus on the importance of honesty, there is actually a great deal of disagreement, both contemporary and ancient, about whether honesty is truly always good. Consider for a moment a scenario in which a person is asked a question by someone malicious. The moral actor in this scenario knows that if they answer truthfully, they risk subjecting a third party to harm at the hands of the malicious individual. This exact scenario, which was more than just a hypothetical to millions of people in the early 20th century, has been used as a case study to examine whether honesty is always, so to speak, the best policy. Many schools of thought would argue that, while honesty is generally considered good in most circumstances, dishonesty can sometimes be warranted if the intentions behind it are good and it produces good consequences. How compelling are those arguments? When analyzing the strength of an ethical argument, it can pay to examine the internal consistency of the ethical system behind the argument as a whole. While there are a variety of philosophical schools that might hold such a position, the most common contemporary schools would probably be something in the consequentialist category, including Pragmatism and Utilitarianism. To break those terms down for those unfamiliar with philosophy, consequentialism is the principle that we should judge the morality of an act based on its consequences in a particular scenario. Pragmatism is the principle that we should judge the morality of an act based on the practicality of achieving a desired outcome, and utilitarianism is the principle that morality should be based around either maximizing pleasure or minimizing pain. There's one thing that all of these schools have in common. They undermine the concept of universal moral principles rooted in objective truth. Why does that matter? Well, since moral decisions don't occur in a vacuum, but rather in the context of everyday life, and since life doesn't consist of just one moral actor, but rather many who live together in a society, actions can't be considered solely as a singular act, but rather must be considered within the context of what society would look like if everybody used the same moral reasoning in their daily lives. What would happen if pragmatism and consequentialism were the basis of social ethical reasoning? According to the philosopher MacIntyre, when the citizens of a society don't act according to consistent, socially agreed upon principles that can be applied in a universal and thus fair and impartial way, the trust and integrity that act as necessary bonds between both individuals and institutions within society begins to erode. Why? Simply, it is extremely difficult to be just when people lack a common framework to guide ethical decision-making. When conflicting moral claims are treated as equally valid, without any definitive basis of judging between claims, arbitration of these disputes falls prey to preferentialism, undermining the legitimacy and authority of the judgments made. This is especially true in the case of utilitarianism specifically, as the philosopher Immanuel Kant highlights in his work The Metaphysics of Morals. If there are no universal moral constraints protecting individuals from acts taken in the pursuit of a collective end, in other words, if there's no concept of intrinsic universal rights that cannot be ethically violated, then people who ought to be treated as ends in themselves will be reduced to mere means towards ends. something I've suggested in my Civility Matters video, undermines the fabric of social cohesion. So, if universal moral principles are necessary for social cohesion, how do we tackle the concept of honesty from such a framework? Well, since we're trying to be objective, it helps to begin by defining terms. We will define truth as the correspondence between what is said and objective truth. And we will define honesty as the virtue of attempting to speak and act truthfully. According to the medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas, honesty is absolutely essential to the proper functioning of society. As he writes in his Summa Theologiae, quote, "Since man is a social animal, one man naturally owes another whatever is necessary for the preservation of human society. It would be impossible for men to live together unless they believed one another as declaring the truth to one another." End quote. In other words, if men deal with each other dishonestly, they would not be able to live and work together harmoniously. MacIntyre, previously referenced in this video, builds upon this argument. According to MacIntyre, virtues such as honesty are not merely individual traits, but rather are patterns of social behavior rooted in shared values that are deeply embedded in social practices and traditions. If society is to function properly, it must, as Aquinas says, give to each man what one man naturally owes another. In other words, a society must cultivate justice, or the principle of giving to each his due. What is the relationship between honesty and justice? According to Aquinas, dishonesty harms the honor and good name owed to others, thereby committing an injustice. In the case of speaking ill of someone falsely, a person may be deprived of good relationships, good opportunities, good status, and good reputation in a way that causes material harm. In the case of falsely boasting about someone, a person may earn a position not due to them, and for which they are not properly qualified, causing harm to others. This probably makes intuitive sense to most watching the video. But what about cases where no material harm is readily apparent as a consequence of dishonesty? Even if one could argue that dishonesty is not an injustice in such a case, it nevertheless compromises one's integrity, both in terms of developing a habit of being truthful and in terms of being trustworthy to others in society. So how might Aquinas argue one should act in the hypothetical scenario mentioned earlier in this video, wherein a malicious actor asks an individual for information that, if truthfully shared, could cause harm to a third party? He would likely argue that, while dishonesty is wrong, other individuals are not always owed truthful information. When truth is shared, it must, as he writes, be, quote, clothed with due circumstances, end quote. There are cases in which, quote, it is lawful to hide the truth prudently, keeping it back, end quote, albeit without lying. Why? There could be many reasons. In addition to the scenario considered, where someone is seeking harm against another unjustly, there may be cases where, for example, an individual has a duty to protect confidentiality. In any case, this position is not so rigid as to prevent prudential judgment from being used to withhold truth in situations that warrant it, even if one doesn't lie. What about a scenario where there is no way to protect someone without lying, because prudential withholding of the truth would be insufficient? Here, it might be helpful to make use of the principle of double effect, or a principle of ethical decision-making utilized when an action has two or more known effects, at least one good and at least one bad. This principle is very useful for dealing with scenarios where there doesn't immediately seem to be a clear answer, from deciding whether to storm a hostage holdup when doing so might lead to the harm of hostages, to deciding whether to give chemotherapy to a pregnant woman with cancer when doing so might lead to the death of her child, to deciding whether to use less than humane methods to interrogate someone for information that could save lives. According to this principle, outlined by philosophers such as John Finnis, for an action to be ethical, the action considered independent of circumstances must be morally good or indifferent. Intention must be good, the good effects must not be achieved through the bad effects, and the good effects must outweigh the bad effects. How would this principle be applied to lying to protect someone? lying fails to satisfy the principle of double effect, because the good effect is achieved through the bad effect, and the action considered independent of circumstances is not morally good or indifferent. This is definitely a controversial answer for many people for understandable reasons. The value of such an answer, however, is that it maintains the universality of moral principles, preventing the breakdown of a common moral framework that MacIntyre warns about. What do you think? Is lying ever justified? Is honesty necessary? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when new videos are released. Also be sure to like this video so that YouTube recommends it to others. If you'd like to support this channel for as little as $1 a month, you can also become a supporter on Patreon. Links in the description of this video. While it's true that some moral quandaries may be difficult, if philosophy were always easy, there'd be nothing left for philosophers to discuss. I look forward to exploring these quandaries together with you. Be curious, seek the truth, and in all things, act with justice and integrity. Peace be with you. This has been The Philosopher.